Confronting Conflict with Courage workshop. If we could find our seats, please. It's just about time for us to begin. So you want to learn about conflict. You want to learn how to deal with it or how to cause it. Considering we all have sin natures, I don't think we need lessons on how to cause it. So we're going to talk about dealing with it. Let's pray, and we'll see what the Lord has for us in this last workshop. Father, it's hard to believe we're at the last track of workshops on the day, because it seems like just a few moments ago we were beginning the day at 9 o'clock this morning. Once again, we do ask your blessing on this workshop and the other three going on at this time, that they would be beneficial and they would help to encourage and equip and edify the school staffs that are here. Lord, we pray that you would speak to our hearts as only you can, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Confront conflict with courage. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 18, Paul wrote, "If it be possible." Well, he said if. That means it may not be possible. "If it be possible, as much as lieth in you." Well, that means you and I have to take a great deal of responsibility in dealing, handling, managing the conflicts that we are a part of. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, then live peaceably with all men. Now, when I do a workshop on CEC, especially this kind of workshop, it is my purpose, my goal, to be practical, to not be theoretical. That all sounds good, but you can't do anything with it. To be practical, for you to be able to take some things home with you that you can use. Having said that, just because I'm the one up here saying these things in a workshop like this, doesn't mean I get it right all the time. I don't. But just because I don't get it right all the time, doesn't take away from the validity or the truthfulness or the accuracy of the things we're going to talk about. In a fallen world, we all face conflict. Now, I believe there are some people, some personality types, some temperaments, if you will, that just enjoy a good old-fashioned fight. They like to argue. And a lot of times it's not with any malice or forethought. They just like a good old-fashioned argument. That being said, however, most of us hate conflict and want to ignore it and hope that it'll go away. But it doesn't go away. And if ignored, it only becomes worse and more difficult to resolve. Conflict is a normal and even a healthy part of relationships. After all, two people can be expected to agree on everything all the time, even Christians. And been in some situations where I feel like saying especially Christians. Conflict can happen between two staff members, between staff and parents, between staff and students, between husband and wife, between parents and children. Since relationship conflicts are inevitable, learning to deal with them in a healthy way is crucial. When conflict is mismanaged, it can harm the relationship. But when it is handled in a respectful and positive way, conflict provides an opportunity for growth, ultimately strengthening the bond between two people. By learning the skills we need for successful conflict resolution, we can keep both our personal and our professional relationships strong and growing. Obviously, conflict arises over or from differences. Conflict occurs whenever two people disagree over their values, their motivations, their perceptions, their ideas, their desires. Sometimes these differences may look rather trivial, but when a conflict triggers strong feelings, a deep personal and relational need is usually at the core of the problem. For example, a need to feel safe and secure, a need to feel respected and valued, or a need for greater closeness and intimacy. In personal relationships, a lack of understanding about differing needs can result in distance, arguments, and even breakups. In workplace conflicts, differing needs are often at the heart of bitter disputes. When you can recognize that conflicting needs can be legitimate and become willing to examine them with compassion and understanding, it opens pathways to creative problem solving, team building, and improve relationships. When you resolve conflict and disagreement quickly and properly, mutual trust can flourish. However, as Paul said in the middle of that verse that we just looked at in Romans 12, we must recognize and acknowledge that which is mine to change. We are not responsible for other people's actions or reactions to us, but we do have to take possession. We do have to take ownership of our own attitude and our own behavior. We need to ask ourselves, where do I need to take responsibility for my contribution to this conflict? Have I done all that I can to achieve reconciliation? But if we're going to ask those questions, we have to be brutally honest with ourselves. Let's face it, we look at ourselves rather subjectively. I've often said the easiest person for me to talk into anything is me. I can talk me into anything. I can justify anything that I said or did in my own mind because I'm looking at me very subjectively. After all, we tell ourselves, well, I'm simply reacting to them. They have the problem. But when we become vulnerable before God and ask Him to hold up the mirror to us, and we see that rarely do we handle situations perfectly, we can always learn something about our own behavior to help us grow. So first, let's identify 5 things that are necessary for successfully managing and resolving conflict. The first of those 5 is we need to make the relationship the priority. Maintaining and strengthening the relationship rather than winning the argument should always be our first priority. However much we may disagree with someone else, no matter how much we believe in the point we're trying to make, we should attack the argument, not the person. Be respectful of the other person and his or her viewpoint. Secondly, we need to focus on the present. If we are holding on to old hurts and resentments, our ability to see the reality of the current situation will be impaired. This is especially true if you've been married for a long time, or if you've been together as a staff for a long time. Rather than looking to the past and assigning blame, focus on what you can do in the here and now to solve the problem, to resolve the conflict. Our third one is somewhat important. Actually, it's very important. Don't allow bitterness to take root. The writer of Hebrews talked about the root of bitterness. The root of bitterness grows in the soil of hurt that has not been dealt with properly. Let me say that again. The root of bitterness grows in the soil of hurt that has not been dealt with properly. Think about what a root does. A root absorbs and stores. That's what it does for a plant, right? The roots absorb moisture and nutrients from the soil and stores them until the plant needs it to produce a flower or fruit or leaves or whatever it might be. The root of bitterness does the same thing. It absorbs and it stores. Paul told us in 1 Corinthians 13 that love keeps no record of wrongs. But bitterness keeps very, very detailed accounts. The only way to eliminate the root of bitterness is forgiveness, which is our fourth foundational point. We have to be willing to forgive. Resolving conflict is impossible. Remember, Paul said, if it be possible. Resolving conflict is impossible if we are unwilling or unable to forgive. Resolution of a conflict lies in releasing the urge to punish, to get even, to get back, to get revenge, which can never compensate for our losses and only adds to our injury by further depleting and draining our lives. Same writer of Hebrews talked about, or he said that, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. God says, I will repay. God says, at some point in the future, I'm going to right all wrongs. We may see some of them. We probably won't see most of them. But God says, that's my job, his job, not ours. When I wrote that sentence a moment ago, I didn't write it a moment ago, but when I wrote it, being married to an English teacher can be terrible sometimes. You're very self-conscious about what you say. When I wrote that, I thought about the novel by Alexandre Dumas, The Count of Monte Cristo. If you're familiar with the book, the main character had some horrible things done to him, horrible, by people he thought were his friends. And the entire book is dedicated to that man who became the Count of Monte Cristo, is dedicated to him getting even with everybody who wronged him. And there were a lot of people. And not only did he get even, but he got even in spades. He got even in a way that was uniquely related to how they had wronged him. His revenge was related to how they had wronged him. But the point of the book is, when at the end of the story, he has gotten revenge on every person one at a time. But at the end of the story, there he stands with nothing and no one. Even the woman he loved had turned her back on him. Long before anyone betrayed or belittled you or me, we betrayed and belittled God. Sometimes intentionally, maybe many times unintentionally, but the fact remains we did it. And we've been forgiven. So the person who has been forgiven much has much room to forgive. And that includes all of us. So if we're going to resolve conflict, we have to be willing to forgive. And then our last foundational point is we need to know when to let something go. If you can't come to an agreement with the person or people on the other side of this conflict, we need to agree to disagree. It takes two people to keep an argument going. I can't argue with myself. If a conflict is going nowhere, then we can choose to simply disengage and move on. We're not going to agree about this thing, so we'll just take it and we'll set it over here and we'll keep on going. So now, let's build on those 5 foundational points with these tips for managing and resolving conflict. First one's much easier to say than it is to do. We have to remain calm. Conflict usually engenders strong emotions and even anger. But in such a state, we are unlikely to be particularly rational or in the mood for compromise. Anger simply pours gasoline on an already burning fire. So we need to try not to overreact to difficult situations. By remaining calm, it will be more likely that others will consider our viewpoint. If we get angry, if we lose it, if we begin emoting, almost everybody else will discount everything we say. No matter how truthful our position may be, no matter how accurate our facts may be. But if we're just blowing up, they're going to discount everything we're saying because they're going to say it's just emotions. Facts alone, however rational, facts alone, however true, usually cannot resolve conflict because how people perceive those facts are colored by their emotions. But it's no good to deny that those emotions exist. They do. So we need to make an effort to see the situation the way the other person does and to acknowledge their emotions before endeavoring to move beyond them. Much has been written in the last 5 years or so on this topic. It's called emotional intelligence. And in a nutshell, what emotional intelligence is I know that I'm going to react. I'm not even going to say respond. I'm going to react. Certain things that people say and do, I know that habitually I react that way. So I try to be aware of that, and when somebody does or says those things, I purposely don't react that way. I try to react different. I try to respond, actually. And then on the other side of the equation, I know, especially people we spend a lot of time with, family members, fellow staff, or whatever, I know what their buttons are lots of times. So I know if I do or say this, I'm going to get this reaction from them. So I try to stop smiling back there. I try to say or do things that I know I won't get the normal response from that person. It's being emotionally aware. One way of doing this is to use phrases such as, let me try to explain how I see things. I don't get angry. I just calmly say, let me try to explain how I see things. Or, please allow me to explain why this is so important to me. And then you turn the coin over. You say, I would like to understand better how you see this situation. Or please explain to me what is important to you in this problem. Try to remain calm. Second tip, be aware of displacement, especially where anger is concerned. Sometimes the source of a conflict is not what it appears to be, as the anger has been displaced. I was told in a pastoral counseling course that more divorces are caused by nylons hanging over the shower curtain rod and toothpaste tubes squeezed in the middle than by any other causes. Is that true? Of course not. That's displacement. Something else is the real problem. But the couple is focusing on the toothpaste tube. The toothpaste tube is not the problem. And if all we're going to talk about is the toothpaste tube, we're never going to solve the problem. That's displacement. We got to back up and find out what the real issue at hand is. It's not easy to spot displacement, but a warning sign is when matters that do not normally cause conflict now appear to do so, like a toothpaste tube. Next, we have to be specific about what is bothering us. Again, seems simple, but we don't do it. We don't want to generalize. It's best to avoid words like never and always, because almost never is always the situation. Now, some personalities, some temperaments are more prone to hyperbole. They like the words never and always. I'm married to one. Before you go tell Mrs. Dawson I'm telling stories on her, I will tell stories on myself in a few minutes. But such generalizations as never and always are usually, almost always, almost always, inaccurate. Vague complaints are hard to work on. Telling someone directly and honestly how you feel can be a very powerful form of communication. Not being unkind, but just being frank. But most of us don't do that. We hedge, we hold back because for any number of reasons. But how can you solve the problem unless we are specific about what the issue is? We see this on our CEC bus as we travel. Where do you want to eat lunch? I don't know. Where do you want to eat lunch? I don't know. Where do you want to eat lunch? Well, somebody please tell me where you want to eat lunch. If I don't like it, I'll tell you. If it's sushi, I don't like it. But so we have to be specific. Kind, remain calm, but be specific. And then we have to deal with only one issue at a time. Don't stockpile. Storing up grievances and hurt feelings over time is counterproductive. Try to deal with problems as they arise. In other words, we need to keep short accounts. Ever heard that before? Don't introduce other topics until each is fully discussed. This avoids what is called the kitchen sink effect, where people throw in all their complaints while not allowing anything to be resolved. You pastors many times may have encountered this in a counseling situation, especially a marital counseling situation. You got two people in front of your desk, and man, they're just going bam, bam, he did, she did, he said, she said, bam, to pile up. Whoa, time. Let's go back, let's back up. Let's talk about the first one. Don't throw all of the ammunition there at one time. And then if we're going to resolve and manage conflicts, we have to choose our battles. Conflicts can be draining. No, they can't. They are draining. So it's important to consider whether the issue is really worthy of your time and energy. This one's going to hurt. In truth, most conflict is over matters of little substance, and often it is pride or status that is at stake. In nearly 39 years of marriage, when Mrs. Dawson and I have had agreements, when we finally get to the point where we're actually communicating, we usually find out we're saying the same thing, we're just coming at it from a different direction. And when we get to the point, usually it's a matter of pride or ego, and neither one wants to give on that point. The words, "I was wrong," can come out equally as easily from a man or a woman's mouth. We need to consider conceding the point to the other person. This will save time and energy, and you can concentrate on the important issues of difference rather than the smaller ones. And if your concession is done with good grace and even some humor, it may disarm the situation entirely. We were newlyweds. I was still managing restaurants. I should have been leaving for work. I was working the night shift that day. We had a disagreement. Even as a brand new husband, I knew enough that I shouldn't leave for work till we got this thing squared away. I did make it on time, barely. But new bride, she's sitting on the bed crying. We've worked through and we're just about there to resolving the issue. I sit down on the other side of the bed, an old-fashioned wooden bed with wooden slats. You know what happened? Bam! All the slats fell out, the box spring and mattress fell on the floor. We laughed and it was done. Sometimes conceding the point, if you do it with a little bit of humor, can resolve the entire thing. Even if you didn't plan on the humor. And then if we're going to resolve conflict, we need to avoid accusations. Accusations cause us to defend ourselves. Accusations cause other people to defend themselves. When we make assumptions about the other person's point of view and willingness to compromise, they may be quite wrong. Actually, point of fact, they usually are wrong. Whenever we make assumptions, a good portion of the time, they're wrong. When we make assumptions about another person's motivations or directions or whatever, we're usually wrong. So, instead of accusing the other person of something or them accusing us, we need to talk about how someone's actions make us feel. Telling how the situation makes you feel is not accusatory. If I say, when you said this or when you did this, it made me feel this way. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just saying, when you said that, that's how it made me feel. Or they could do the same thing. That's not accusatory, but you're communicating. Next tip. We want to resolve conflict. We have to avoid clamming up. I told you I was going to tell stories on myself. Mrs. Dawson tends to hyperbole. This is me. We get in a disagreement. I don't want to talk about it. I'm done. We are not having this discussion. When one person becomes silent and stops responding to the other, frustration and anger can result. Because the other person wants to to get this thing resolved, and somebody like me, I'm done. I am not going to talk about it. But positive results can only be attained when two-way communication takes place. So if we want to resolve the conflict, one of us can't clam up. Now, this next point, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on it, and it seems like a simple thing to do, to learn how to listen. But it's not. Hearing is easy. Listening is hard. Listening takes an act of our will. Listening is a posture of attentiveness which acknowledges the presence of another person. Much conflict could be avoided if we listened. And conflict cannot be resolved without listening. If we're going to learn how to listen, number one, we need to focus. Ask if anything remains unspoken, giving the other person time to think before answering. Encourage the other person to share his or her issues as fully as possible by saying something like, I want to understand what has upset you, or I want to know what you're really hoping for. And then listen to the reasons that they give. The biggest mistake, and we all know this is true, the biggest mistake most people make when it comes to listening is that we are so focused on what we are going to say next, or how what the other person is saying is going to affect us, that we don't listen to what's being said. Focusing may seem like a simple suggestion, but it's not as easy as it sounds. It is amazing how incredibly distracting our own thoughts can be. Squirrel! Have you been in a conversation where a thought goes across your mind like that, and then you're gone? You're chasing the squirrel. We need to focus on the other person. Now, this next one, I want to let you know before I say it, that this is a pet peeve of mine. Okay? You've been warned. It's a pet peeve. Actually, it's a very large, hairy pet peeve of mine. Put away your phone! It's impossible to listen well and monitor your phone at the same time. Nothing turns people off like a mid-conversation text message or even a quick glance at your phone. Now we have Apple Watches and various other things that you can be a little bit more discreet. You can just kind of flip your wrist up to see what's going on, rather than taking your phone out of your pocket or out of your holster or out of your purse or whatever. Now, we all know, and there may be some of these people in this room, there are some people who act as if their hand has been replaced with this. It's like it's a permanent fixture at the end of their arm. But they keep getting bigger, so they won't even fit, in one hand anymore. And we know there are some people that if this thing makes one little burp, gurgle, buzz, blink, whatever your ringtones are, there are some people, it's like it's an addiction. It's a compulsion. They have to look at it. They have to. And it's a weather alert in Afghanistan. Who cares? When that happens, I feel like saying to some people, you don't even know what that is or who that is. But you're saying it's more important than I am, and I'm standing right in front of you. If we're going to resolve conflict, we have to commit ourselves to the conversation in which we're trying to resolve the conflict. Focus all of our energy on that conversation. You will find that conversations are more enjoyable and effective when you immerse yourself in them. You know what? You and I are amazingly interesting people if we just listen to each other. But you can't listen if you don't put your phone away. I'm finished now on that. Still under learning how to listen, we have to clarify the real issues rather than just making assumptions. Ask good questions that allow you to gain this information and which lets the other person know that you're trying to understand. Make sure that you understand what the other person is telling you from his or her point of view. People like to know that you're listening. And something as simple as a clarification question shows not only that you are listening, but that you also care about what they're saying. In addition to verifying what you've heard, you should ask questions that seek more information, like, what happened next? Or, why did he say that? The key is to make sure that your questions really do add to your understanding of the speaker's words. If you ask questions for information, number one, they know you're listening, and number two, they know you care enough to really understand. The key is to make certain that your questions really do add to your understanding of the speaker's words rather than deflecting the conversation to another topic. Don't try to take over the conversation. Listen to what they're saying. And then still under listening, we have to practice reflective listening. Reflective listening is the listening strategy of paraphrasing the meaning of what's being said in order to make sure that you've interpreted the speaker's words correctly. By doing this, you give the speaker the opportunity to clarify what they meant to say. When you practice reflective listening, you don't simply repeat the speaker's words, but you use your own words to show that you've absorbed the information. You restate what you've heard so that you're both able to see what has been understood so far. Mr. Walker and I are having a conversation, and at some point I may say, "This is what I heard you say." And then he can say, "Yes, that's what I meant," or "That's not it at all." And so then he explains it to me again, and hopefully I'll get it the second time. That's called reflective listening. I don't repeat what he said. I take my understanding of what he said and put it in my own words, and then he can tell me whether it's right or not. Still under listening, if we're going to resolve a conflict, we need to use positive body language. We need to be aware of our gestures, our expressions, and our tone of voice and make certain that they're positive. Using an enthusiastic tone, uncrossing your arms, maintaining eye contact, and leaning towards the speaker are all forms of positive body language employed by great listeners. Many times I have been in a situation, maybe some of you have, where a person's words are saying one thing, but their body language is saying something entirely different from what their words are saying. That may be intentional, but it may not be intentional. For example, if we were talking out here in the foyer, many of us did this morning, it's not uncommon for people when they're talking, when they're standing up especially, to cross their arms. Most of the time it's because we don't know what to do with our hands. But we may not mean anything by crossing our arms, but to other people, crossed arms can mean a defensiveness, a lack of receptivity, or many other things. So if you know you are prone to cross your arms in a situation like that, make yourself uncross them. Put your hands in your pocket, put them behind, do something with them so you don't cross, so you're not communicating something that you didn't intend to communicate. Replace it with a positive body language. Enthusiastic tone of voice, facial expressions. When we first got married, Mrs. Dawson thought I was mad at her all the time. She said, "Because the look on your face." I said, "I can't see my face. I don't know what it's doing." It's doing it. But when she told me that, I had to consciously smile, do something. It must have worked. She's still around, so. Look people in the eye. Don't stare them down, but look them in the eye when you're talking to them. Instead of watching the traffic go down the road in the window behind them, or watching the ant crawl up the wall. Look at the person talking. And again, don't invade their space, but again, you communicate receptivity if you lean a little bit towards the speaker rather than leaning away from them. Positive body language can make all the difference in a conversation. This doesn't apply to dealing with conflict, but positive body language, this is extra, no extra charge for this. When you answer a flag in a learning center, body language speaks volumes. Especially if a child has asked you, maybe you've said as a supervisor, I know they need help, but they won't ask me. This is especially is possible when a child has asked you more than once for help with the same concept. And for whatever reason, they're just not getting it. And they've raised their flag, and you walk up behind them, and you look down and you see, there it is again on that PACE page. And you walk up behind a child and you go, you didn't say a word, but you communicated a whole lot. That's why that child doesn't want to ask you for help, because it could be worse than that. Maybe we go and say stuff too. Communicate, positive body language. And then still under listening, don't pass judgment. If you want to be a good listener, you must be open-minded. For many people, open-minded is a bad thing. But being open-minded makes you approachable. Having an open mind is crucial in the workplace, where approachability means access to new ideas and help. To eliminate preconceived notions and judgment, we need to see the world through other people's eyes. Now, for those people who think being open-minded is a bad thing, they need to know this. Being open-minded doesn't require that you believe what the other person believes or that you condone their behavior. It simply means that you quit passing judgment long enough to truly understand what they're saying. I think that would have application to a witnessing situation. If we're so judgmental, we're passing judgment on everything they say, it's going to be difficult for us to ever get to the point of presenting the gospel where they receive it. So if we're going to resolve conflict, we got to quit passing judgment. And then we have to resist the temptation to interject our own point of view until the other person has said everything that he or she wants to say and feels that you have listened and understood his or her message. If we are not checking for understanding, reflective listening, or asking a probing question for additional information, we should not be talking. Not only does thinking about what you're going to say next take your attention away from the speaker, hijacking the conversation shows that you think you have something more important to say. What we don't realize is that when we jump in with advice or a solution, we're shutting the other person down. Guys, if you're married and your wife wants to tell you something, 90% of the time, you paying attention, Mr. Delbridge? 90% of the time, she doesn't want you to fix it. She wants you to listen. But we're guys. Fixing things is what we do. But if we listen to 2 or 3 sentences and we go, well, you could do this, 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 and this, and solve the whole problem. She didn't want you to solve the problem. She wanted you to listen. But if we jump in too soon with advice or a solution, we shut her down. And she probably hasn't gotten to what she wanted to tell you in the first place. Pastors, in counseling situations, you can do the same thing. You're saying, well, they came to me because they wanted my advice. But again, we need to listen. Because if we jump in too soon with the solutions or advice, they shut down. And they maybe haven't told us yet what they came to talk to us about. It's essentially a more socially acceptable way of saying, okay, I've got it. You can stop now. Now, we probably wouldn't say that, but the effect is the same. Mrs. Dawson loves junk catalogs. She cultivates junk catalogs. When we move and they don't forward that stuff to her, she goes back out online and signs up for new junk catalogs. One of the ones she gets has t-shirts and sweatshirts and whatnot that have usually humorous sayings on the front or back. One that I saw recently describes what we're talking about here. It said, "I've stopped listening. Why are you still talking?" We wouldn't say it, but sometimes that's what our actions do say. Then, we need to validate the concerns of the other person, even if a solution doesn't seem to be available at the time. Expressing appreciation can be a very powerful message if it is conveyed with integrity and respect. Things like, "I really appreciate that we're talking about this issue," or "I'm glad that we're trying to figure this out." Again, you may not believe what they believe, you don't have to condone their behavior, but you're at least giving validity to what they're trying to tell you. And then sometimes, if we're going to resolve conflict or manage conflict, we have to change the environment to some neutral place. I have an office. Many of you have an office. But when I'm talking to somebody in my office, I have a distinct psychological advantage. If I'm sitting behind my desk in my office, I have an even greater psychological advantage. Now, sometimes you may want that, depending on the situation, you may want that psychological advantage. But if you're trying to resolve, manage, or deal with conflict, that psychological advantage may be detrimental. So I have two chairs in front of my desk. Well, the person talking to me is in one. If I want to neutralize that psychological advantage, I'll get up and go around the other side of my desk and sit in the other chair. Then we're on more of a level playing field. But we're still in my office. So there's a conference room across the hall, diagonally across the hall from my office. Sometimes we'll go over there. It's a conference room, big table, lots of chairs. But it's more neutral. But sometimes you even have to go to even a more neutral place like a coffee shop. There's a Dunkin' Donuts. You could throw a rock from our office and hit the Dunkin' Donuts. Lots of business is transacted at the Dunkin' Donuts. I say that in jest, but they know lots of people from our staff at the Dunkin' Donuts. You know, the first time Mr. Howard stuck his head in my office door and said, "Mr. Dawson, you want to go get a cup of coffee?" I'm thinking, dear Lord, what have I done now? There wasn't anything. We just moved into our house. He just wanted to talk. He wanted me to tell him about my house and all that. It was a neutral place. If he'd called me to his office, I probably would have passed out. But anyway, if you're at home, sometimes you need to move to a more neutral place. Go out on the porch. Go out on the patio. Or maybe you need to go to the Dunkin' Donuts. They have good coffee, by the way. Or to a fast food restaurant. You just have to change the environment to a neutral place. If we're going to resolve conflict, sometimes we got to compromise. This may be an obvious point, but it's frequently neglected because we're going to compromise. It means both of us have to give up something. And then if all else fails, wait. Most problems change over time. Either the problem resolves itself because circumstances change, or one's attitude to the problem changes as the heat dies down and other matters assume greater importance. I think that's what's behind the statement, well, why don't we sleep on it? Because even just a few hours can make a big difference. Psalmist said, "Weeping may endure for the night, but joy cometh in the morning." No matter how bad it is, almost always things look better in the morning when we got a little bit of distance. Isaiah said, "They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength." If you can't solve a dispute and its resolution can wait, maybe the best approach is to leave things alone for a while. And when you come back to it, like I said, it may have solved itself, or you certainly got a different perspective now. When handled in a respectful and positive way, conflict provides an opportunity for growth, ultimately strengthening the bond between two people. By learning the skills you need for successful conflict resolution, you can keep your personal and your professional relationships strong and growing. We began the workshop with that verse from Romans chapter 12. Let's end with this verse from Psalm 133 verse 1. "Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity." Where does that unity come from? Learning how to manage and solve conflict.